Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture in this benighted age, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/vm. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on Spotify, YouTube, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And visit patreon.com/vmspod or paypal.me/vmspod to make a one-time or recurring donation and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. Well, it was another interesting weekend. On Friday, Saturday and Sunday were just zombie days. I just chilled the hell out. Friday, I hosted the memorial service for Tom Spurgeon in New York City at the Society of Illustrators. And that was good. It was, I had a lot of anxiety building up to it. I think largely just for the organizer of an event anxiety that I usually have, as opposed to, any concerns I have about speaking in front of an audience, especially a group of cartoonists and comics adjacent people, or talking about Tom, which I'm perfectly comfortable doing, even if it involves me breaking down in tears. So, yeah, bunch of anxiety over the week, but once we were in the moment, I was free. I spoke from the heart. I kept my comments to a minimum. We recorded the entire event, so I'm hoping we'll be able to convert that into a bonus episode of the podcast down the line, and we'll also be sending the recording to the Billy Ireland Library, the cartoon library in Ohio State, so they can keep that as part of their archives for Tom. But it was a good event. There was a program of speakers, and then we just had a sort of open forum session where people could come up and talk about Tom's impact on their lives, their careers. A lot of people who didn't know Tom too closely or too personally, but nonetheless felt driven by him to make better work. It was good. I had a good time. I gave a gift to all of these people who knew my friend and couldn't make it out last month to Columbus for the main memorial. So that was Friday. I got home pretty late. I picked up a burrito larger than my head at this great taco truck up on West 96th Street before getting in the car at 11:30 at night and driving up the West Side Highway, George Washington Bridge, etc. on the way home. I ate the entire thing, dear listener. I managed, with no traffic, cruising at 60 or so miles an hour to devour this thing without dropping a grain of rice. And then made it home, and when I woke up the next morning, I felt at peace in a way that I haven't in the 2 months since Tom's death. I really felt as though, not as though I'm over it or something, but just that I know that he's gone, and that absence now has a definition to it. I think it was more just the time of everything rather than some sort of catharsis around the memorial event. But regardless, I feel more at peace with losing him. Now, that said, a day later when we got the news that Kobe Bryant died, I had that immediate, holy shit, I have to call Tom vibe. That sort of thing is going to stick with me for a long time ahead, but we move forward. And speaking of forward, our guests this week are Joan Marans and Antonio Masi. They are the collaborators behind a wonderful book, Lady Liberty, an illustrated history of America's most storied woman. The book is from Fordham University Press, and it consists of a series of essays about the Statue of Liberty, accompanied by these gorgeous watercolor paintings. Joan is the writer, and Antonio is the painter. It really is a lovely book, and it explores not just the history of the Statue of Liberty, but all the meaning around it, the changing face of immigration in American history, the economic and social era in which it was built, the role of Emma Lazarus's New Colossus poem and how that gained meaning and invested the statue with meaning over the years, where it may not have meant quite what it did when it was first put up in the Bay. And there's an awful lot more in the book, too. It's only about 100 pages long with 33 watercolors by Antonio in it. And Joan's essays are wonderful. They're artfully written. There's this gorgeous introduction that covers the immigration stories for both her family and for Antonio. And the two of them, they just form this fantastic collaboration. So when I was pitched the book, I tossed out my usual I only record with one person at a time policy, figuring they'd be able to groove as well on mic as they do on the page. And they do. They trade off pretty nicely in this conversation. And, I mean, when you get down to it, now more than ever, it's just crucial that we understand the importance of the Statue of Liberty and the symbolism of America's history as a haven for immigrants and refugees. And I mean, I'm first generation American. My parents came over not facing some great hardship, but they came to America for opportunity. And that's what this country's about, regardless of how you get here. So what I'm saying is Lady Liberty from Fordham University Press, it's a must read. And maybe it's a good gift for people who don't know that history too well. Now, as caveats go, the room was kind of echoey. I noticed that the moment I stepped in, big high ceilings, and I was like, oh, it's going to be an echo, but we'll deal. Also, because it was the three of us, I used a 3-mic setup, and my channel was the mics I don't normally use, so they had lower levels than the other two. I tweaked the gain on that a little in post to fix things, but you'll notice I come off a little bit quieter than the other two speakers. And we recorded on November 21st, so about 2 months ago, and that's why we're talking about some current events as though they were current. Here are Joan and Antonio's bios from Lady Liberty flap copy. Antonio Masi is a world-class and award-winning artist, often honored for his depictions of bridges. His magnificent paintings are exclusively featured in the book New York's Golden Age of Bridges. Masi is also president of the American Watercolor Society. His artistry has been featured in Artist Magazine, PBS Sunday Arts, NBC Today, Newsday, and many other venues. He has also participated in the New York Times video City Living, A Tale of Two Bridges. A sought-after artistic master and scholar, he travels the world as a teacher, demonstrator, and lecturer. Joan Marans Dim is a historian, novelist, and essayist. Her published work includes the novel Recollections of a Rotten Kid. She also co-wrote 2 histories, The Saga of New York University, Miracle on Washington Square, and most recently, New York's Golden Age of Bridges. Her essays and op-eds have appeared in the New York Times, the New York Daily News, Barron's, Investor's Business Daily, the Huffington Post, and many other publications. She also participated in the New York Times video City Living, A Tale of Two Bridges. Critics, citing the scope and depth of her work, describe her prose as laced with impressive depth, a droll wit, and an elegant narrative. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Joan Marans Dim and Antonio Masi. Let's just start with the origins of the book. Where did it begin? Where did Lady Liberty start for you, and how did the nature of the collaboration come together?
Well, this is, first of all, it's our second book together.
Yeah.
And we've been friends since high school. Mm-hmm. And we both went to the High School of Art and Design. Yeah. Antonio was an illustration major. I was a cartooning major.
You were a what major?
Cartooning.
Good. Because I interview a lot of cartoonists also, so yeah. We'll get back to...
I thought about it for a while, but then I decided it was writing more than drawing and writing that I was interested in. So our earlier book.
Our earlier book was about bridges. Mm-hmm. We were the first ones to actually have done all the major bridges of New York, the 9 major bridges. I've been the only artist so far that I've known, or anyone has known, that has painted all 9 of them. Mm-hmm. And we found, in discussing this, that each one of the bridges has its own history, its own personality, and we found that rather intriguing. Not just how different they look, and yet they came almost from the same designers. Mm-hmm. 6 of the major bridges of New York, we found out, were designed by one man, and no one knows his name.
Really?
Othmar H. Amman is his name, and he was a wonder. The thing about writing a history, because prior to writing New York's Golden Age of Bridges, I had written a history of New York University, and I also had written a history of a couple of the schools within the university. But what I really learned, and that was fundamental about writing a history, if you just write a history about a bridge, or even about bridges, or even about a statue as brilliant and as famous as Statue of Liberty, it's really not all that interesting. But when you put it into the context of political history, social history, economic history, and you understand, for example, with the bridges, that it was part of the development of the city, and its social life, its economic life, and all that. It's a much more interesting book. And the book also, I think, showcased Antonio's amazing ability to look at these bridges and then replicate them in ways that people really never looked at them before that way. So that was a very interesting journey for us.
The bridges I refer to as almost people. There's a portrait of each bridge. Mm. By that I mean, I thought about the people that worked on them. For example, the 59th Street Bridge, the Queensboro Bridge, now also known as the Ed Koch Bridge. They changed names, as you know. My grandfather worked on that bridge for 9 years, from 1900 to 1909. So when you work on something that you have a personal connection, it becomes more important. And you could almost feel the sensation of, say, my grandfather working on it, because as I was growing up as a little boy in Italy, because I was born there, I always heard stories of my grandfather working on this bridge. Now, what did he do? Well, he was just a laborer. Didn't do anything of major importance, except he was one of the people that made it happen.
Without them, it doesn't exist.
That's right. So when we got to the aspect of the bridge, we found that the people were very interested who worked on these bridges.
Most of them were immigrants, actually. And, in fact, immigrants really built and rebuilt this nation throughout its history. But the Statue of Liberty, the idea of doing the Statue of Liberty came about in a fairly lucky way. We were actually supposed to do a book on the Brooklyn Bridge, and we were interested in it, and we had some new information on it and new ideas about how to write it. But it turned out that the publisher had a book that year on the Brooklyn Bridge, so he needed another subject. And he asked us what we'd like to do, and I immediately said the Statue of Liberty, because I thought I could see the relevancy of it,
About what year was that? Because I assume it was very recent.
Yeah, it was just about 2 years ago.
Okay, yeah.
Wasn't it about 2 years ago?
It was about 2 years ago.
Post-2016.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Yeah, in other words. Yeah.
But the other aspect of that Joan's is she saw a statue possibly in it, and I agreed with that. But I saw the other aspect, the human aspect, the immigration. Mm-hmm. Because the Statue of Liberty wouldn't be the Statue of Liberty unless there were immigrants that came here.
Yeah.
I soon realized that that immigration was a central issue in the meaning and purpose of the Statue of Liberty. And even when the way I start a book, I always try to do a contents page, and it came very quickly. Yeah. The whole idea, it just sort of fell into place. I did change a few things here and there. I never really foresaw an entire chapter on Emma Lazarus, the author of the poem "The New Colossus," but poetry was actually very important to the Statue of Liberty. In fact, without it, we wouldn't even be sitting here talking about it. So the book evolved in a very really truly organic way. Not all books evolve that way. Mm-hmm. But like all books that you write, at least that I write, this is my fourth, it's a journey, and it's full of surprises and adventures even. And this book was filled with that. And I've always felt a little guilty about being labeled historian, because I always feel that I don't know enough, honestly. But I saw an interview recently with David McCullough, mm-hmm. and he said something that was very important to me because I'm a great admirer of him. He said every single book that he's written about, when he started, he didn't know anything about the subject, yeah. and he said exactly some of the things that I feel. It's not important to know everything. If you're a historian, you find out all these things. Right. And that's the journey. And it's filled with many unexpected twists and turns. And same is true with writing a novel, really.
That is possibly very true for writers. But for painters and artists, it is a different approach.
Yeah.
I feel the subject. I get very close to it. In this particular book, Lady Liberty, and especially immigration, I went through the process of immigration. I am an immigrant. Mm-hmm. So I felt very personal. It was not difficult for me to visualize and feel what these people went through. The Statue of Liberty is it's an expression, it's a symbol of what these people went through today. But when these people came here, like myself, we did see the Statue of Liberty in Lower Manhattan Bay. I saw the statue as a little boy standing on a deck at night looking at it and had no clue what was it all about. Yeah. The only clue I can think of what other people have said when they came here, the statue was wonderful. It was great. They knew they arrived. It was a symbol, a guidepost that we made it over those 13 or 14 days on the North Atlantic in the winter, in those ships. But when they got here, that was just a signpost. They arrived in America. What they were really concerned about was, now, how do we feed our families?
It was not exactly. It was a concept.
It was a signpost that they made it, and many of them said, "God bless America." Yes, because they made it. So, as an artist, it was easy for me to do the paintings and the sketches in the book because I went through some of those things. I know people who went through them. So I knew when the painting was done that it was right or wrong. I did about 60 or more paintings. We only used about 33 in the book. So therefore there were some rejected and some not. So it is a process, but my process is different. I knew what I was going to paint beforehand. Which is quite the opposite of Joan.
How much was that selection process like in terms of, what you were developing in terms of the contents, Joan, and then Tony, figuring out which paintings and drawings fit them?
What we did is she would write a chapter or part of a chapter and she would email it to me. I would read it. I would do some sketches, some paintings. I would send them to her. It was a back and forth, an exchange. At the end, we sat down I think we had a few meetings. I had all the sketches and we selected the ones that would fit in the right places so that it flowed. and emphasize what she did, and at the same time her writing would reflect what I was trying to do in my painting.
Right. I think it worked as a collaboration very well. I mean, when we were doing the bridge book, we literally walked all the bridges we could, and it was a very intense experience doing that. And I mean, I can still remember some of those walks. Some of those walks were in the dead of winter. Remember that walk across the Manhattan Bridge?
Yeah, we did also in the winter the Williamsburg.
Oh, yes. God almighty, I forgot about that one. I mean, and probably the worst walk we ever had was the Queensboro or the Ed Koch Bridge, because it's so damn long. And it's such an unpleasant bridge to walk. It's so dark and dingy, and I just didn't like it. But the best experience I think we had was, frankly, the Manhattan Bridge. I don't mean to switch subjects, but it just was amazing. Amazingly cold, clear, brittle day. We walked across the bridge, had a wonderful meal in Chinatown, and then we walked back. And most people don't realize, if you really want to see the Brooklyn Bridge, you walk across the Manhattan Bridge.
Yeah, so you can see it in process, not simply
exactly. And so we were pretty much alone on the bridge. Nobody would dare go on the bridge. It was so cold and miserable.
Well, the other problem with the Manhattan Bridge is that there's a tremendous amount of graffiti on it.
Yeah.
And so people sort of stay away from that.
Yeah, it's a little scary, I suppose, but we weren't scared. And it's noisy, too, because the trains roll across it. It's a real workhorse, the Manhattan Bridge. In fact, Times once did a story on the best, most favorite bridges, and they called me up as one of the experts, and they said, "What's your favorite bridge?" Everybody loves the Brooklyn Bridge. I said, "Well, it's actually my least favorite bridge."
Why is that?
Because there's no fun to walk across. It's even dangerous and too crowded. And I have a lot of theories about what they should do with the Brooklyn Bridge, which I won't share with you.
No.
But the Manhattan Bridge is, to me, is a wonderful bridge, and they've fixed it. It's beautiful now if you really go over it. It's noisy, and it's still a workhorse and all that stuff.
But the Brooklyn Bridge was built with the pedestrian in mind. It's the only bridge that has a walkway for people. Like that big.
That's true.
It was built that way, purposely for people to enjoy.
As a suburban guy, when they were getting rid of the Tappan Zee Bridge,
they got rid of it,
which is a nightmare. But one of the proposals was to leave it there and just make it pedestrian. I'm of two minds. A, it's nice that there's a new bridge. B, the fact that they're calling it the Governor Mario Cuomo Bridge, I'm not so, it'll always be the Tappan Zee. It doesn't matter that it is physically a different bridge than that. It's still the Tappan Zee to, those of us who drive, which, I imagine you experience. But then the bridges, well, John Roebling, at least, from the bridges, becomes a major feature within Lady Liberty.
I used him as sort of the model Anglo-Saxon American that was welcomed into this country. I think he came around 1831, 1832. He was young, he was healthy, he was highly educated, actually brilliant. He couldn't work at his profession immediately. He was a terrible farmer, but he farmed in Pennsylvania, and he finally got into bridge building. And some 50 years later, the Brooklyn Bridge went up. So, I mean, it's an extraordinary story, but in terms of immigration, it underlines America's welcome of white Anglo-Saxon, educated males in this country. And as time went on and as the country began to grow and it became clear it was going to need a lot of people to build it. And then it became, we got to the Civil War and it became, the country needed to be rebuilt, really. Sure. We needed even more people. But the people who were already here wanted to come didn't really come. A lot of people from Eastern Europe came. These people were uneducated. They didn't have the kind of resources that somebody like Roebling came. And that's when a lot of trouble in America with immigration really began in the mid-1800s.
Well, that was when the railroads were being built, as you know, and Chinese labor they brought them in when the railroads was finished. They didn't need them anymore.
Right,
so
1875, the Chinese Exclusionary Act.
They just put no more Asian people allowed to come in. It was like that. But insofar as the East Coast goes, right after the Civil War, the Industrial Revolution is what took off. As uneducated, as poor as these people were from the southern part of Europe, they were needed. They needed labor. They needed people who could stand at a machine and just do the same repetitious thing over and over again. They didn't have any immigration laws at that time because there was a tremendous need for labor. I think between, 1865 and 1900, over 13 million people came to America.
But I think it's important to say that America needed more than people with strong backs. They needed writers, artists, mechanics, plumbers, doctors. It needed people to raise up the country. And among those people were definitely laborers, people who could help build the country. But by the end of the 1800s, the borders, were closed, and there began to be a sense of, well, we don't need as many people anymore, and we certainly don't need the Chinese. We don't care much for the East Europeans, and World War I sort of fixated people more on the sort of anti-white feeling. There was a lot of tribalism. The famine Irish had a terrible time. They were probably had the worst time of all the groups that came. And by 1924, there was something called the Johnson-Reed Act. And basically that act tried to exclude all people who were non-white, really keep it down. And they succeeded for quite a while in doing that.
Yeah. And you bring up in the book the lack of a refugee law, which leads us to the St. Louis getting turned away and
well, insofar as that goes, my father, or my grandfather, going back to him on the Queensboro Bridge, he came in 1898 specifically because there was work here. The work was on the bridge. He worked there and there were no laws at the time. People would come and go back and forth without any problem.
No overstaying a visa or anything.
There was no visas. There were nothing. So he stayed for 9 years to make money. He did. He went back, and he took his family, except my father. My father was a little bit of a rebellious kind of person. Said, I don't want to go back. He was having a good time in America. World War I broke out. And at that time, Italy was on the side of the Allies. And my father decided that he was going to go back to Italy and join the army. Someone convinced him to join the American army. And that made him a citizen, which made all his children naturalized citizens. I mean, it was something he did. I'm sure he had no idea what was going to happen. Yeah. But then after World War I, the immigration laws started to come into play. And he was very fortunate that it became a citizen before. Today, if you serve in the army, you're still not a citizen.
You're going to get deported.
Which is unheard of, unbelievable.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that gets back really to the meaning of the Statue of Liberty and the purpose of this book. Because this book is about art, it's about poetry, it's about immigration, and it's about politics. And it's really a book for everybody who is an American and everybody who wants to be an American. That's why we wrote the book, and we did the pictures for the book. Because as far as I can tell, and I've done a lot of reading about the Statue of Liberty, there's no book like it out. There's no book that really addresses in contemporary way the meaning and purpose of the Statue of Liberty today. And what I wanted to do in my writing, and also to convey through Antonio's beautiful paintings, was to understand, was to give people a true understanding of what America is. I mean, are we a nation that truly welcomes people? Does the Statue of Liberty really mean something? Has it meant something? How did it get to mean something? And what does it mean today, especially today, when in this gnawing age of miseries?
The fact that we're recording the day after Lieutenant Colonel Vindeman testified, and just as somebody who, and I'll start crying if I talk about it too much, used to march down Washington for Soviet Jews, seeing one of these guys who came over as a 2 or 3 year old explaining, what it meant to be American and why he can testify ultimately against the president in a country that, had he done that in his home country,
not be afraid,
he'd be kaput. It reminds us a great deal of what immigration is and what it means.
I was very moved by his testimony yesterday and his courage. And when he addressed his father yesterday and said, "Dad, don't worry about me. I did the right thing." That was an incredibly moving moment. But it takes courage to get up there and do that.
Certainly.
And so we take all of that in, and then we look at the Statue of Liberty, and I wanted to ask the question whether, I wanted to sort of find out truly what our history was. This goes back to David McCullough again. I wanted to understand the meaning of what we were. Were we nativistic? Were we racist? Were we tribalistic? Were we sexist? What kind of people are we? Are we as good? Is our advertising real, or are we frauds? Is Donald Trump an anomaly, or is he a logical result of who we really are?
Well, the Statue of Liberty, going back to the statue for a moment, because that's the title of the book, as Joan, very, very well put in the book, the Statue of Liberty was nothing more at the beginning than a sign of friendship from one country to another country. It had none of this meaning that we attach to it today. It was never meant to be that way. It was a gift from the people of France to the people of the United States. Not the rich people, not to the rich people, but the average Frenchman who contributed to the building of it, to the American average person who supposedly contributed to building the base. It was a joint effort.
Well, it was, that's certainly a way of looking at it, but I look at it a slightly different view of it. It was, the original title of the Statue of Liberty was Liberty Enlightening the World. And the Frenchman La Boyer was a great scholar in 1865 when he had this cocktail party. And he invited the sculptor Bartholdi and a bunch of other people to talk about perhaps building a Statue of Liberty, which was by no means an original idea. There are lots of Statue of Liberties all over Europe. And the reason that they were doing it was because they greatly admired, it's sort of ironic today, they greatly admired the American Constitution, the principles of democracy, the Jeffersonian, Madisonian ideas that we hold so dear. And they wanted those ideas for France. And they were kind of scared about dedicating a Statue of Liberty. They thought they could get thrown in the Bastille or worse. So they had to be careful. They had to be careful. And they really didn't get started with building it until about 1870, when finally Napoleon III got deposed and they got rid of him, and things started to change a little bit in France. They weren't so afraid anymore. So there was this undercurrent of feeling about what the statue really meant and why it was so important to the French people. And in some ways it had more to do with their feelings about the miserable life that they were living under, the kind of life they were having in France. But they also, this great admiration for American democracy, that was palpable and real. And it's a miracle that the story of how the statue actually got built is really amazing. because nobody was much interested in it in the United States until a Joseph Pulitzer, who was himself a Hungarian immigrant, and owned a newspaper called The World at the time, which was sort of a flashy. He was ahead of his time as a newspaper
proto-tabloid.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so he created this campaign in which people could send in their nickels and dimes and quarters, and everybody who did, name was listed in the paper. As a result of that, he raised $100,000 in nickel, dimes, and quarters. Now, any fat cat entrepreneur in America living on Fifth Avenue could have easily slapped down the money, but they wouldn't do it. But Joseph Pulitzer did it with nickels and dimes and quarters.
Well, it was also the New York State donated or allocated $50,000 towards the building of the base.
Yeah.
But at that time, Grover Cleveland, the governor, vetoed it. 2 years later, after he vetoed it, the statue was being dedicated. There were parades down Broadway, all the way from, I think it was 42nd Street to Battery Park, and the French flags, American flags were being waved, bands were playing, marching, etc., and they got to Wall Street, ticket tape, people threw the ticket tapes out. And that's the first ticket tape parade, was the Statue of Liberty. But when they got to the actual dedication, there was Grover Cleveland. Now he was president, Grover Cleveland, of which he took all the glory and the honor for this Lady Liberty now having found her home here in America. Normal politics.
That's how it always works.
That's the way it always works.
Yeah.
You know?
You shoot it down, and then you take all the credit for it.
Right.
Yeah. I thought it was particularly poignant to point out, as you did in the introduction about the dedication, that no women were there except for the two who were part of it.
Right.
No blacks. Everything that was liberty, but for us.
Exactly.
Not.
And more than that, Emma Lazarus, who wrote the poem "The New Colossus," wasn't invited.
Yeah.
And what the suffragettes did to me is very remarkable. They rode out in a rowboat and speechified around it. I can't imagine doing that in the Hudson River. I mean, you can get pretty cold there in October and windy. Mm-hmm. And they were just ignored. The dedication was a really tawdry affair. And once it was over, and Emma Lazarus died a year later of lymphoma. She had a short but very splendid life. I'd like to talk a little bit about her at some point. Nobody really cared about it. It didn't really have much meaning. And it stayed that way for a long time until, 1886, and I think it was 1901, some 14 or 15 years later, a woman named Georgina Schuyler, who was quite well-known philanthropist, relative of Alexander Hamilton's, one of the famous Schuyler sisters, was rummaging in a bookstore and found a copy of a book of poems, and in there she saw The New Colossus. And she loved Emma, and she loved this sonnet. And she decided to get it, at least a few lines of it, affixed onto the Statue of Liberty. And by 1903, she succeeded in doing that. Still nothing happened. It wasn't until the 1930s that the rise of fascism and immigrants came over that people began to connect Emma Lazarus's gripping poem, her sonnet, with the meaning of the Statue of Liberty. And that finally, after so many years, gave the Statue of Liberty a purpose in terms of immigration, in terms of refugees. And that was a very important moment. And that's why we're talking about it today, because of Emma Lazarus, not because
there's another part to this we haven't even mentioned, Ellis Island.
Yeah. And that's what I wondered, the significance of the statue because of the proximity to Ellis Island and processing the immigrants.
I've been to Ellis Island. I'm sure maybe you have and whatnot. It's a very moving thing. They have the Great Hall, which has been fixed up, renovated to the way originally it was. The way they did that is they cannibalized all the other parts of Ellis Island to fix that one room. But the real beauty and the real feeling of Ellis Island, if you want to get it, is go and take what we call the hard hat tour. Mm-hmm. It's the part of the tour where average people don't go, or it's not advertised in the public. You actually make a reservation. There's about 10 or 12 people. You get a guided tour. You wear a hard hat, and you go to almost the 80%, 90% of it that's not yet been renovated. Mm. You see the paint dripping off. Yeah. You see the roofs that are broken windows. You see all this, and you go through the dining room where they used to eat, the bedrooms, the hospital rooms, the morgue. It's an eerie feeling to walk through these rooms and long corridors. And there are the small, tiny little cubicles where the people who had contagious diseases were kept. And I've mentioned this before. The most eerie part to me was going into one of those little rooms and seeing 2 sinks. 2 sinks? Why 2 sinks? Well, I asked the question. One was to wash up, which is normal height, and the other one is a small one, chin high. I said, what is that for? He says, well, this was the infectious disease place where people had TB, and when you have to cough up, things come up, and that's what it is. So they had a great hospital system for the people. They took care of the people. Out of over 12 million people that went through Ellis Island, and not everyone went through Ellis Island, by the way, only the people who couldn't afford first class, etc., they only refused about 360,000.
Yeah, I was surprised when I saw that in the book, it was that small a number who returned back for medical reasons.
But the hospital was a great, great thing for America. It really was the first, I would say, hospital system we had on that scale in America that took care of the people.
Yeah, it was a research hospital. And it was striking because a lot of people in America felt, well, why are we spending all this money on these immigrants? Who cares? But we did it anyway. And if a child was sick, they had to separate parents and child, but they never lost track of anybody. There was no, there weren't lost children. And they never charged these immigrants anything. That's the other thing. I mean, there was plenty of graft and criminality going through Ellis Island with the people.
Yeah, but it wasn't a government charging them to for treatment or anything.
Right. I mean, and there's never been a case. There's never been any sort of case where anybody went through Ellis Island Hospital and was shown to have been admitted and then, disease spread. Yeah. There was none of that. And it's quite extraordinary because antibiotics weren't yet in use. I'm not sure if they were invented or not, but they were not giving people antibiotics. And there was a certain largesse, a certain generosity, benevolence and caring that was palpable in spite of the fact that there were objections. And even at one point, there was a lot of trouble at Ellis Island. I mean, people wanted sexual favors. They wanted money. They were just doing all kinds of bad stuff. And President Theodore Roosevelt at the time, sort of set up some rules and really tried to clean up the place. And I think to some extent he did. But it was a scary place to be. And you could even say that the most welcoming experience for these immigrants who were so wary as they came down the Hudson River and got off their boats and stuff was the sight of the Statue of Liberty. It was a source of hope. And for most people, Ellis Island was an island of hope rather than an island of tears. But we talk about I write about in the introduction, Antonio's experience of coming over, which he's mentioned. And I talk a little bit about my grandmother, who took me to the beach one day, luckily, and in Rockaway, and spent an afternoon regaling me with stories of the Statue of Liberty. And I don't think until I finished this book that I completely realized the sacrifices that our ancestors made. It's extraordinary. To me, my grandfather, it looks like to me, walked from the Pale settlement of Russia to Scotland and somehow picked up a boat and came to America. I mean, imagine doing that. He was 18, maybe 17 or 18, never saw his parents again, never saw his brothers and sisters again. My grandmother came over as a little girl, as a young woman, with her parents, and Antonio when he came over, he was allowed to go to the top deck of the ship.
Yes, the reason was because, I don't know, we were really naturalized citizens to a certain degree. There was 10 of us, 8 children, mother and father, okay?
Yeah.
And there was about 50 people in the room, the hall where you were staying. But we did have a dining room, nothing more than a big table where everybody sat. 50 people, you're thinking now. And we did go up to the deck. I do remember the cold winter coming across. But the one thing that I think people don't realize or aware of, when these immigrants first came to America, they already were pre-screened. The ship's captain was responsible for these people. Therefore, if they were rejected, it was the ship's captain who was responsible to bring them back at his own expense and feed them. So therefore, you say only 360,000 people were rejected out of 12 million. Think how many were pre-screened beforehand.
Yeah.
There was a pre-screening going on at that time. And when someone came here, like a family of 5, say, or 4, one of the children had to go back. The mother and the father had to decide who's going to go back with the child and the other one stay. There was a lot of broken families also going on, which we don't have records on. It was quite different then. And as bad as they had it here, going through Ellis Island, it was far better from where they came.
Yeah. And what was America to you when you were a little kid in Italy? Do you remember?
Yes, I remember certain things. You're growing up, you're in a small town, or in our case, we were on a farm, and there were no stores. There was no bakery. There was no milk. My father and mother literally grew everything we ate. My mother made all the breads, sewed all the clothes, etc. And I do remember stories about America because of my grandfather. And you hear stories eventually about how the streets in America are paved in gold. Yeah. It sounds silly. It's it's a movie thing, but it really did happen. And when you got here, and I did see the Statue of Liberty, I tell you the truth, I didn't know what to think.
Yeah.
To me, it was just a symbol. It was a thing. Yeah. Because there were other things on people's mind besides, the Statue of Liberty. We had no idea there was a Statue of Liberty. All it symbolized is you made it. Yeah. You arrived. That's all it symbolized at that point. Later on, when you become more successful as an American, my mother always said to us, "You're in America now. You speak English."
Yeah.
And that's the way she brought us. So now I could appreciate the meaning of the statue. I could appreciate Emma Lazarus's poem. I could appreciate all these things. But that's only because after you have food in your belly.
Right.
Not before.
Once America is fulfilled.
Yeah. Then you understand. Then you appreciate those things. Beforehand, it's just a goal. It's a place that tells you you've just arrived. There's a painting in the book called "God Bless America" of this old man sitting down with just a suitcase, and a smile on his face that says, "I made it." Yeah. That was all. That was his first joy in life, I would say.
How many of the paintings did you work from old photographs?
I worked from old photographs, yes, and Ellis Island, Statue of Liberty pictures pretty much were from my own reference because I went there, I visited there several times back and forth. But the old photographs are like, there's a picture of Joan's grandfather in the book, and there's a picture of Joan's grandmother, and Joan as a little girl in the book. You know, so those were done from reference.
Yeah, I think Antonio was very good at sort of keying the copy to his work. I mean, he worked independently and personally, but then there were certain moments where we could see, you know, a painting here, a painting there.
Yeah, and also to adjust the text to the painting. Because, you know, the statue, like I had a different cover in mind, which was turned down.
Please. What was the concept?
There's a painting in there called, was it The Mother of Exiles?
Exiles, right. Which is a line from the...
Which is at the very beginning of the book. And there's the Statue of Liberty crying with tears in her. I wanted that as the cover. But it was negated.
Understood.
You don't get everything you want.
Right.
But
at a time like this, things are imperative. I mean, I was driving home from a podcast down in Pennsylvania the week after the inauguration, and all the protests are going on at the airports for the anti-Muslim ban, and I was like, I have to, you know, I just pulled over into the airport parking lot, joined the protest for an hour or two, and figuring, again, Jewish mother, you know, she wouldn't have let me, you know, live without the guilt of just passing a protest like that, given everything we protested for in the 80s. But yes, I can understand where that image comes from for you.
Because if, you know, we say she's a mother. If a mother saw what was going on today, how would be her reaction? What would be her reaction? She would probably break down in tears. Mm-hmm. It's so bad.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting what you just said about the day of the inauguration. I happened to be in Greece, in Athens. I was working there, doing some work. And I had some time off. And a partner and I, we climbed the Acropolis, which is the seat of democracy. Yeah. And that's how we spent the day. In that you know, wonderful, uplifting place, and it was an interesting sort of counterpoint to what was going on in America.
So I had the embarrassment from the 2000 election with Bush versus Gore. I was in Milan for a trade show, and so 6 hours ahead, I ended up staying up until 6 o'clock in the morning local time, only to find out we didn't have a president. And in that case, I had to spend the next 3 days with Italians making fun of us for having a bad constitutional system. And I was like, you guys have had 5 republics since the last 40 years, and I can't fight back on this one. Really just, you know. But yeah, there are those times you're in those you know,
I mean, it's just a lucky coincidence in a way. And I don't know if it was lucky or not, but there was something about being
fortuitous,
there. Yeah, that was very meaningful. Mm-hmm. And I remember we were with a number of Greeks that day, and they just couldn't believe it. You know, I mean,
we're supposed to be the adults in the room.
Right, exactly.
It was the same thing. I asked an American guest of mine who lives in Italy, who lived there for 30 or 40 years, this poet and writer, and I asked her, you had experience in Berlusconi. You know, how are we going to deal with the next couple of years? And she's like, Gil, it's Italy. No one takes us seriously. This is America. This really matters.
Well, actually, there are a lot of similarities to Berlusconi.
Oh, yeah, there are a lot. And that's why I was hoping she'd have some ability to cope.
They have a sort of a different way of treating politics over there.
That's also
it's like Greece too. They don't pay their taxes. They don't go to jail if they don't pay their taxes. There's a whole
things are looser.
Yeah, it's a definitely different world.
I wanted to talk about the artistry of the statue itself, and coming from your perspective as a visual artist. I assume I don't know if you've worked in sculpture.
Yes, I did.
Oh, have you? How does it work for you? The statue versus
a few facts about the statue first of all, and then you get a better image. She's 151 feet tall and 1 inch. She weighs over 80 tons. Don't ask a woman her weight, okay? And her waist is 35 feet. Mm-hmm. That's, but she's very thin-skinned. Yeah. Her skin is only the thickness of a pencil. That's how the statue is hollow. Mm-hmm. Originally, thoughts were to fill her in with sand, but luckily that was turned down. And it was this Gustav Eiffel, I believe, who designed the interior, which is nothing more than a tall steel pillar in the center with a spiral staircase. I'm sure you've been walked up it, with arms projected out from it attached to the sides. That is so that when she's in lower Manhattan Harbor and the winds blow, it would hold her down in place. But she does move. Yeah. She sways. Every tall structure, especially bridges, sway when the wind blows, because if it doesn't, it'll be knocked over. Right. The artistry was rather interesting because she was made in about 214 pieces. They had to assemble it in France and then disassemble it, crate it and ship it here, and then reassemble. The technique they use is what they call repoussé, which is very old. It's an old medieval method of taking a sheet of copper with a hammer, and you just hammer it into the shape you want. Mm-hmm. They did make molds for the different parts. The question is, who was the model? Some will say it was the wife, some will say the mother. I would tend to think it was both. He was, Bartoli, who was the sculptor, by the way, was very much under the influence of his mother. His mother controlled the purse strings. Mm-hmm. And I think at one point he did admit that it was his mother's face, but the body of his wife.
Which creates all sorts of horrible connotations, but it's pre-Freud, so it's okay. Yeah.
So it was not a healthy relationship.
No, it was a healthy relationship. But when the statue was finally going to come to America, the French did not want to give it up. Yeah. They loved it. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was their attraction. It was the tallest thing in Paris. The Eiffel Tower had not even been built yet, but it was a promise. So the Americans living in Paris at that time decided to get together and have a half-size replica built so that they can give it to the French as a gift. It's still in Paris. It's on the Seine River, on a small island, and she looks to New York. She's facing New York, looking for her big sister. The reason we have the Statue of Liberty because when Bartoli first thought about a giant statue like that, he was going to do that for the Egyptians because the Suez Canal had just been finished. And he went there with drawings of a statue as a lighthouse. That was the concept, was to be a lighthouse. But the Egyptian government refused it because it was too expensive. So he had the drawings, the ideas, but it didn't happen until later on that it was reused in a different form, but still a lady with a light.
But the engineering aspect of it to get to that size without it collapsing, without the weight, without everything.
They did over 9,000 calculations to try to make it work. That was before the computer.
Yeah.
So they were quite amazing, those people.
The engineering was the most revolutionary thing about the statue, the interior engineering. If it was constructed the way it was originally conceived by another architect who had very fortunately died suddenly, instead of Eiffel, it would never have worked. It would have fallen over. They could have never taken it apart. They could have never shipped it anywhere. It would have just fizzled out. Yeah. But probably the smartest thing that that Bartholdi did was hire Eiffel. Now, I do think from what I've read that Eiffel felt that he didn't really get the full fame from this revolutionary idea and all that sort of stuff. So, and at the time, Bartholdi felt that his statue was the tallest statue in the world. I don't know if that's true or not. It certainly was the tallest in New York. So the very next thing that Eiffel did was the Eiffel Tower, which dwarfed the Statue of Liberty.
On balance, historically, we all know the Eiffel Tower. Nobody says Bartholdi's Statue of Liberty. So, yeah.
Yeah, and nobody especially says, well, Eiffel was the brains behind it, you know.
Made it stand up.
But Eiffel was really very interesting man, and he was a great mathematician. He really, the Eiffel Tower is a wonder, but his work was very identifiable, and if you look at the body of his work, it's like looking at Picasso or somebody you recognize immediately, because all of his work has this sort of look to it, this greatness, this bulk, this heaviness, and yet a good deal of charm. So he was an interesting character in his own right. But Bartholdi, unfortunately, his fame was fleeting, and he died rather embittered that America didn't ever give him another job to do or give him some money or continue to think he was fabulous. They just forgot about him. And that was the end of it.
And as an artist, do you ever think of scale like that?
Well, my watercolors are big.
Yeah.
The statue I was talking about, well, this is
we have a significant size one right here.
Yeah. So that's usually the size I work. Mm. So I do think size is important, but not because it is big, but the subject that I paint is big. Visualize that painting small, it wouldn't give you the same feeling as a bridge, a huge bridge. So my size of my paintings is determined by what the subject is. I have to select huge subjects, therefore I work large. Mm-hmm. The last painting, the Lady Liberty one, is 8 feet tall, the watercolor. Wow. So I try to...
Is it difficult working in that medium at that size?
It's not difficult. It's just a lot of work.
I assume, yeah.
It's just a lot of work with a ladder underneath you to get up to the top. But I enjoy working that large because it gives me complete freedom. I actually paint with my whole body. I mean, you see artists sitting down at a chair and just using their arm. But I love to work standing up, using my whole body to sway. I learned this from musicians. A musician literally gets his whole body into his work.
One of the great watercolor artists I've recorded with, Robert Andrew Parker,
yes.
Up in Connecticut last year, jazz drummer, and 4 of his 5 sons are jazz drummers also, which leads to the question of how did the 5th one get out of it? But it's an odd thing. He's the artist, the 5th, and Bob doesn't understand his son's art, which is also a whole strange route. But he talked about that also, that beat and that rhythm you get into in the process of making.
And you cannot get into the rhythm of a painting when you're sitting at a table and you're working small and all you're doing is having your wrist motion. Mm. It's not physically possible. Yeah. Therefore, I like to work large, not because it's impressive, but because emotionally it's a great release, and you really get into the painting. That's why I work large. Is it difficult in watercolor? People say yes, but I say no because I do it all day long.
Yeah, if it's a thing you're accustomed to.
In fact, I once taught a workshop where everyone had to work large, no smaller than 60 inches tall. But they had so much fun, and they felt so liberated after that they could never paint small again.
Do the two of you have comparable what the blank page, what the blank canvas means to you, like the opening of possibility or anything? I ask this as a neurotic who's incapable of starting any work of art myself. From the writing or from the painting perspective, is there a crossover in terms of this is blank, I'm going to fill this somehow?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Everybody has their own little sort of safety valve or door that they go through. Mm-hmm. My particular way of doing it is I read something by E.L. Doctorow.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's particularly one, it's a fairly short piece that he wrote. I'm trying to think of the name of the book. I have it here. But it's just a book of pictures of old New York.
There's one you cite in Lady Liberty. I'm blanking on the title of it.
Yeah, I could go get it, I guess. But
I'll
anyway,
mention it in the show notes afterwards.
Okay,
so.
but he just wrote the foreword, and every time I sit down to write something, to begin something, I read that foreword, and one of my great sadnesses in life, because I worked at New York University for many years, and he taught there for many years. I don't know how much he taught. He was mainly had an office and he wrote.
Yeah.
But I used to see him all the time, and I always wanted to say something to him, just to tell him how much I appreciated his work. And I saw him at NYU Hospital when I was there. I was visiting someone, and that was the last time I saw him. He didn't look well, and he was with his family, so there was no way you could ever possibly talk to him. And shortly thereafter, he died. But for some reason, there's something about the energy of his writing and the thoughtfulness of it and the humanity of it and his ability to see into other places that only his imagination could take him is very inspiring, and it's a good way to start a project for me. And the last 3 or 4 books I've written, that's the way I do it. I still do it that way. Sometimes I go back to it even if writing an op-ed or something. Yeah. So everybody has their own formula for
just a trigger of sorts.
Turning the knob, on what turns you on. Mm-hmm. But
well, to me, I have to be there. In other words, I have to experience what I'm going to paint. Mm-hmm. I go to the bridges, I paint them afterwards. I go to the Statue of Liberty, I paint it. I go to Ellis Island, I paint it. I paint pictures of people. I know some of those people, like you, as in my own family that I painted in the pictures of. I have to emotionally be involved in some way with what I'm going to paint. So when I look at that blank canvas, doesn't scare me because I know what I'm going to do. I feel it already. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't turn me off. Yeah. If anything, makes me eager to cover it up quickly. Yeah. I'm not afraid of it. That's what usually most people look at a blank canvas and get scared of. What am I going to do with it? That's because they haven't had the emotional feelings to start out with. All my paintings are emotional. They came out of my childhood, and they're still coming out. Yeah. So this is how I don't feel that scaredness.
I would hope. You managed to make this. You managed to produce the books.
Right. Yeah. There's another thing about his Antonio's artistry that I think is very unusual, and I've written about how he paints somewhat, especially in the bridge book. When we walk bridges, we just don't walk on the bridges. We walk, when we can, underneath the bridges. We walk around the bridges.
We touch them.
Yeah,
we feel them.
Exactly.
The grittiness, the paint chipping, the coldness of the steel.
Right. You can't always touch what you want on a bridge. I remember on the Golden Gate Bridge, you could actually touch the cables. You could feel them vibrate.
Or the George Washington Bridge, when they says, we're not allowed to do that.
Yeah. We almost got kicked off.
You get arrested. I almost got arrested a couple of times because of that.
They don't like him doing that. But, I mean, he looks at bridges in ways that other people never see a bridge. And I think that's what makes his pictures so startling sometimes.
Well, the other aspect, Joan, is that I don't use the traditional brushes the way that are being used. One particular painting, I used an eyedropper.
Right.
Yeah. Or another one, I used a comb, my hair comb, dipped it into the paint, and I felt that's what I needed. In other words, as Joan once wrote in the book, I think outside the paint box.
Right.
If you think outside the paint box, your paintings will be, I wouldn't say just different, they'll have a different feeling when people look at it. Yeah. If you traditionally paint the same way, people have seen that. But give them something they haven't seen before, they'll go, wow, that's interesting. That's different. And that's what I try to do in the work. Whatever I see, one of my favorite places to go buy art supplies is Home Depot.
Yeah. Why not?
Yeah. Brushes, combs. I have one of my best brushes is a brush that they used for paper hanging. I use for my watercolors.
Don't you think if J.M.W. Turner was alive, he'd go to Home Depot?
Yes, Turner was one of those people who would use anything that worked.
He was ingenious.
I mean, he had in his pinky, he had a very long nail, which he would use to paint with and scratch things out.
Yeah. To me, it's one of the joys of the Frick when you see the big Turner.
The one thing I try to impress on people when I teach workshops is when you're working and something flows into your head, whatever it is, and it's related to what you're doing, do it. It's someone is trying to tell you something, follow your instincts. And they say, oh, no, I shouldn't do that because that's not the way it's done.
The rules.
Yeah, the rules. And I said, that's where you're being blocked. That's where creativity's being blocked by that. You've got to just go with what you feel at that moment. It may be a disaster, but at least you get into the habit of listening to that little person up in your head telling you what's going on. That's such a hard thing for people to do, to trust themselves.
Well, I think that same logic applies to creative writing.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to
It's
be...
the lesson that artists keep telling me is giving yourself permission.
Yeah.
And as the person I recorded with right before this, she said when she's teaching, and it's more cartooning that she teaches, it's the same. Give yourself permission to tell the joke or to draw it this way, and you'll find out something one way or the other.
Right. You can always throw it away in the garbage.
They don't have to be perfect. Yeah.
What?
They don't have to be perfect from the...
I mean, nothing ever goes down on paper and stays, for a writer. It's all about rewriting and rethinking and getting it right. But the essential thing... this goes back to something that Tony said about sort of planning and knowing what he's doing. I think it's really important to know as a writer when to sit down and when not to sit down. You have to have some sort of a thinking about where you're going. That's why I always like to do a content page first, even if I don't follow it, even if I decide later on I'm not going there. Because, it's not like you're going to sit down and you're brilliant. You need to know the subject. You need to read. You need to talk to people. If you're collaborating with somebody, you need to collaborate. So it's a process, and usually it can't be rushed. And if it is, it's never as good. And as you get older, and we're sort of old now, you hopefully learn a thing or two, and you get a little better at it.
Last question, because we are getting after 3:00, and you need to get back. More collaboration? Is there another
well, we're thinking about it. Yeah. Somebody asked me the other day what I wanted to do next, and I said, what I want to do is write books that people read and want to read and benefit from and learn from. So I think the Statue of Liberty was a terrific idea for a book. But now the challenge is to come up with something just as terrific.
Yeah.
I agree, to come up with something terrific, but something that I emotionally have a connection to. I don't paint unless I have an emotional connection with it. So whatever subject I select or selects me, that's what I will be doing. I don't know what it will be. So right now, what I am painting now, yes, I'm just doing a few more things that I've done in the past that some variations of the past that I didn't do then, but still are things in my mind that I wanted to do, and I'm getting to doing them now.
Joan, Antonio, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that was Joan Marans Dim and Antonio Masi. Lady Liberty, An Illustrated History of America's Most Storied Woman, is available from Fordham University Press, and it really is a treasure. Like I say, about 100 pages, 7 essays plus an introduction, plus a foreword by Joseph Berger, and about 33 watercolors by Antonio. It's really a wonderful package and educational, but in a good way. So give it a look. Now, Joan doesn't have a website, but she's on Facebook as Joan.Maransdim, which is JOAN.MARANSDIM. Antonio's site is Antonio Masi, which is ANTONIOMASI.com. He's got, it's a great website with lots and lots of his watercolors and artist philosophy, etc. Now, we had to wrap early, so I didn't get a chance to ask, so, who you been reading? Still, if you want to hear our other guests' answer to that question, you'll need to become a supporter of the Virtual Memories Show so you can get access to our quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet. I'll get the fourth quarter 2019 episode up soon. You can check out the third quarter episode featuring an hour of book recommendations and fun conversation with Carl Stevens, Emily Nussbaum, Kate Maruyama, Laniers, Christopher Brown, Caleb Crane, David Shields, Dawn Raffle, Amor Tolles, Simon Doonan, Simon Critchley, and Sylvia Nickerson. You can support the Virtual Memory Show via patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod. I've got all sorts of goals and goodies in place for patrons, including that podcast, a patron-only blog, handwritten show notes for every episode, a secret project that I really should get back to, especially because I just got a new issue of King Cat from John Porcellino today, and my secret project is a zine, so I'll get to it, okay? I will get to it, and more. So go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. I recorded this episode at Joan's home in Brooklyn as part of a 3-podcast in 2 boroughs day. That means $12 at the GW, another $30 for parking, a couple of $2.75 subway trips, and a lot of coffee. Now, if you want to help defray some of the costs of the Virtual Memories Show, like web hosting, travel, equipment, coffee, or just toss me some money because you think this show is worth it, then visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and make a one-time or recurring donation. A special thanks go out to Nick Bartosik, Buzz Carter, Michael Hacker, Michael Janizik, Fred Kish, Annie Koyama, Jonathan Kranz, Kevin Katila, Jack Lescamella, Stephen Nadler, Barbara Nessim, Jim Ottaviani, George Fow, Payne Prophet, Dmitry Samarov, David Small, Stephen Solomon, Greg Tanner, Ford Thomas, Armando Veve, and Garrett Zecker for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories show. We have the full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSpod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. Now, you've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.